Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. Today I have a series spotlight for you guys. I am going to be talking about the Bill Hodges Trilogy by Stephen King, which consists of Mr. Mercedes, Finders Keepers, and End of Watch. So the way this is going to be structured, I am going to start off talking about just my thoughts about the series as a whole. I will then go into each book individually. This will all be spoiler free. And then at the end, I will be going in and talking about spoilery things, but I will include kind of a break to let you guys know when the spoilers are going to come so that you don't see anything that you don't want to. So my thoughts on the series as a whole, this is definitely kind of a departure from the normal Stephen King that I have read. By now, everybody on this planet knows that Stephen King is first and foremost a horror writer. So this being an actual more detective trilogy is definitely a departure from what we know him best for. However, even though it is that, detective real world thing, it still does deal with horrific events. One of the things that I didn't like about this series so much is it is very inconsistent. I really enjoyed the first book. The second one kind of felt like it was forced in there. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And the third book, while it was okay, I did struggle with a couple of different things about book 3, but I will say that the way that it ended was pretty satisfying. So let's talk about the specifics of book 1. So brief synopsis, Bill Hodges, he's a retired cop. He hasn't been retired for very long, and unfortunately, whenever he did retire, he left one of his biggest cases that he had ever had, which is the case of the Mercedes killer, unsolved. The Mercedes killer is a very deranged individual who drove a big Mercedes sedan through a crowd of people who were waiting at a job fair and killed several of them, seriously injured even more. However, as Hodges is kind of settling into his retirement, and believe me, that settlement is not easy, he is contacted by the Mercedes killer and things kind of pick up from there. It really gives him a new purpose and something to work towards as he starts to worry about what the Mercedes killer may do next. So in my opinion, this was the strongest in the series for a couple of different reasons. One of the things that I really loved was the psychological element of the Mercedes killer himself. He's one fucked up individual, and as we actually go through the parts of the book that are narrated by him, it's just really intense because it almost feels like you're watching an episode of Criminal Minds because you're really in the mind of the Mercedes killer, and it's really intense for that reason. Honestly, that was probably one of the best parts about it for me. It was, kind of that tension and that knowing that evil can really live right next to you under the guise of the ice cream man or whatever, and we may actually have never had a clue to begin with. I mean, look at John Wayne Gacy and tons of other real life serial killers. It's just one of those things that's always fascinated me. That aspect of it, as well as the actual description of the acts of the Mercedes killer, are really intense, and for that reason, it's true King fashion, not for the faint of heart. I did really enjoy the cast of characters that came into play. Jerome and Holly were, I thought, great additions to the cast. Each of them served their own purpose and helped the story progress. The pacing in this one was probably the best of the entire series, and when we get to the end and everything finally resolves, it definitely ended in a way to let us know that this was going to be a series, that this was not the last that we were going to see of the Mercedes killer. And also, there are very large trigger warnings in this book for suicide and suicidal thoughts. So that's just something to bear in mind. So moving on to book 2, Finders Keepers. This was probably my least favorite of the series. Honestly, it felt like he just kind of forced it in. It was clearly a means to an end. It was kind of a way to get us from book 1 to book 3 and give himself the amount of time that it was going to take to get to book 3 without having this insane space of time in between. Because I believe from book 1 to book 3, it's a span of 6 years. Book 2 takes place a couple of years after book 1 does, but it's kind of like 2.5, 3 years after. So instead of having the full 6 years, it's just like, okay, well, here's kind of letting us catch up with the cast of characters. But honestly, it felt forced, and I didn't enjoy it. So the book itself introduces some new characters. Basically, what we have is this weird, bizarre new version of Annie Wilkes in the form of Morris Bellamy. He is utterly obsessed with fictional writer John Rothstein's works, and the fact that the way that John Rothstein ended his most famous series made him quote unquote sell out and he's pissed about it. So what does he do? But he goes to Rothstein's house and he kills him and steals his money, and also finds tons and tons and tons of his writing. Well, then he is arrested subsequently for something completely unrelated to his crimes of that day, but he does manage before then to bury the money and the notebooks. Enter Peter Salbers. Years later, he finds the notebooks and crazy things ensue. The pacing of this book was definitely my biggest complaint because it started out pretty strong and then all of a sudden we're 3/4 of the way through and we just spent 3/4 of the book setting up the last quarter of it, and it was just like, okay, you could have cut out a lot of that. Like, there was definitely a shorter way to get to it. There were little appearances of Bill throughout that first 3/4 of the book, but honestly, it really felt like King just forced Bill and Holly and Jerome back into a plot that really could have honestly moved along without them. There wasn't really any character development in terms of Bill, Holly, and Jerome either. I honestly thought that if you were gonna have this story at all, that there would kind of be some kind of like serious development, and really we don't get any of that in that time period. The only thing that we learn is that Bill has been taking care of himself a little bit better. That's all we really know. Again, I just didn't really care about the story or anything that happened, so I really just feel like this story could have been completely left out altogether. I still gave it 3 stars because the core story of Morris Bellamy and Peter Salbers, like, that would have been a good story. It's just we didn't need Bill or anybody else to be included in it. So there was that. And there's very large trigger warnings in this for home invasion and sexual assault and rape. So by the time book 3 rolls around, end of watch, we're back to the Mercedes killer, right? I'm not gonna go into the specifics of the plot because spoilers, I will talk about some of it in a separate section, but once again, the pacing was not the best in this book, and the plot devices that were used to get us to the end were just a little bit strange. One of the things that was noticeably absent from the first 2 books was any type of like supernatural anything. It was real deal like detective stories, versus in this book we did have a little bit more of supernatural element, which I wasn't really expecting and honestly was kind of weird. The supernatural element is explained almost scientifically, but I didn't really buy it. There was a little bit of commentary in this about like groupthink and how screen time can seriously influence us, not just children and teenagers, but also adults, and how some of the things that we see on screens can seriously influence the decisions that we make and the things that we think. I will say that the ending of this book gave me some feelings that I wasn't really expecting to have. It was a little strange in that regard because again, like I wasn't expecting to have these feelings. And we got to the end and I apparently cared a lot more for these characters than I thought that I was going to. I still ended up giving this one 3 stars just because again, the plot devices that were used were a little bit weird and the pacing was way off, but it's not a bad series overall. So overall, as a series, I'd say it's like a 3.5 star series. It's definitely not King's strongest, but it's not his weakest either. The biggest thing that this series suffers from is pacing. I really enjoyed the characters. I liked the overall ideas of the books. It's just some of the ways that he got there took too long or didn't need to be in there at all, or were just plain weird. If you're looking to read something by King that is not necessarily his traditional horror, this would actually be a really good place to start, I think. Just know that it gets a lot better than this. So here's the part where we talk about spoilers. I'm giving you a few seconds to let you know that there are spoilers ahead. So if you don't want to be spoiled for anything in this series, I suggest you click away from this now. Hopefully if you're continuing to watch, that means that you've actually read these books or you actually just want to be spoiled, I guess. So a couple of things from book 1 that I just wanted to discuss. The opening of the book was so intense. Like it really kind of set the stage because, you had these characters and talking about how destitute they were and how desperate they were. And then all of a sudden they get hit by this giant ass Mercedes. And again, the way that it was written, the language that it was written in was really intense and really gruesome. And I loved that because that was as close to like traditional King as we got in this book. Obviously with the exception of some of the parts about Brady. But I loved the opening scene. My mom had actually tried to read this book and she couldn't even get past that, which doesn't surprise me at all. So that was probably my favorite part about the first book. So again, when we talk about Brady, he was one hell of a character. He was very formulaic in a way, you know, it's definitely something that you would be able to see in like an episode of Criminal Minds or something like that, but I still really enjoyed his character and just like learning more about him, why he was the way that he was. He definitely was born a sociopath, like there is no question about that, and just the relationship with his mom and everything just amped the creep factor a whole lot. And it was also that the relationship with his mother specifically was honestly one of the more gross things that I've ever read in a book, but again, coming from King, like that's not all that surprising. One of the things that I didn't really like was the weird extraneous relationship that Hodges had with Holly's cousin. I can't remember her name, the one that got blown up in the car. I didn't care that they were in a relationship. I didn't see the point of them being in a relationship. I really don't know what the point of that was. Like, I'm not even gonna try and speculate. I don't know. I just didn't really care for it. It didn't like fit in my personal opinion. And that's really all the spoilery thoughts that I have for book 1. So then as far as book 2, I just didn't really care about this whole storyline altogether. Morris Bellamy, his character, like I didn't really care about him and I didn't really care about his motivation. I just thought that he was an asshole. He felt very formulaic as well. I think maybe if we had gotten a little bit more of like his inner dialogue than we did, maybe I would have liked him a little bit better, because that was one of the things that I love so much about Brady, was the fact that we did really get to see, you know, like his inner dialogue and that kind of thing, versus we didn't really get to see a whole hell of a lot of that with Bellamy. The fact that Peter lived in Bellamy's old house was like, convenient plot device is convenient. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, really? So much of a coincidence, right? It was one of those roll your eyes moments. I didn't really care for it at all. And once again, I just feel like I would have cared a lot more about the story as a whole if Holly, Jerome, and Hodges hadn't been forced into it. I feel like if he had just changed the narrative slightly, he could have written a whole separate book. And honestly, that's kind of what it felt like. It felt like he kind of had this manuscript and then he like turned it and he made it fit into the Mr. Mercedes universe or something, like I don't know. And again, there was next to no character development, but one of the things that I will say, kind of like one of those hindsight things, is given how book 3 ends and the fact that King made it a point to say how much Hodges was taking better care of himself, definitely hindsighting was definitely kind of a red flag, and really put like, okay, now I see why you made such a point of talking about that, given how book 3 ends. So book 3 is called End of Watch. So did we actually think that it was going to end any differently than it actually did? Like, that's your big question. I was really excited to get back to Brady and to see what was going to happen with that, but the whole thing with the Zappets and the inserting your consciousness into a device of that nature was just really weird. It was done in a more scientific fashion than a supernatural fashion, but I still just did not care for the way that was explained. I didn't really care for it as a whole. I feel like we could have done something a little bit different, but I feel like he did it on purpose, trying to insert that social commentary in there just about screen time and how the internet can really influence us in the way that we think, in the way that we feel about ourselves and things like that. And while I appreciate that commentary, I did feel like it was just a little weird the way that he chose to do that with the Zappets, and I don't know, it was just strange to me. One of the things that I really loved about the series was just like the characters as a whole. Like Hodges I liked, but I really liked Holly. I don't know why I liked her so much. And I read a lot of reviews saying how much they hated Holly, and I just thought that was strange. One of the things that I will say about Holly is that it's made it out like she was this normal person and then she, you know, just couldn't take the pressure and she had a couple breakdowns and that's why she is the way that she is. But the way that she was written almost made it feel like she had some form of like high functioning autism, just the way that she focused on certain things. And I wish that he would have explored that a little bit more and explained that a little bit more. He may have somewhere in the first book, I really can't remember, but I don't remember him saying anything about like any kind of high functioning autism, because that's really the vibe that I got from her. So remember when I said when we got to the end and I ended up like having a lot more feelings than I thought that I would, and that's actually for a couple different reasons. Number one, I did just really like the characters, and anytime you come to the end of a series that you like and you like the characters, you know, you might always feel a little bit emotional about that. However, I'm gonna get a little personal for a second. Again, this is a huge spoiler, so if you didn't want to be spoiled, like, please go somewhere else. The beginning of book 3, we find out that while Bill has been taking care of himself, you know, he is at a more advanced age and he has been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And if you are familiar with pancreatic cancer in any capacity whatsoever, you know that more often than not, it is not diagnosed until it is far too late. And it has a very, very, very high mortality rate. Very rarely is it caught early enough. And honestly, the timing of me reading this book couldn't have been any more coincidental, because I believe a couple days after I finished this book was the anniversary of the passing of one of my aunts, and she also died from pancreatic cancer. It was very much the same way for her that it was for him, in that she didn't realize anything was wrong and she lost a bunch of weight, and then she realized that something might be wrong, and by the time they caught it, it was too advanced for them to do too much. That was one of the other reasons that the ending of that book definitely kind of gave me more feelings than it would have normally, just because of my personal history in dealing with the disease. So yeah, that's one of the reasons that it gave me more emotion. So it probably wouldn't have given most other people emotions, but it did give me some feelings. But anyway, so I did enjoy this series. It's definitely not one of King's stronger works or series. If you want a strong series by Stephen King, read the Dark Tower series. I'm not going to say anything other than that, but that is all I have to say about that today. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have read this series and want to chat about it, comment down below. Keep it spoiler free. If you want to chat spoilers, you can contact me on any of my social media. It is all in the down bar below. As always, if you're new here and you like what you see and you want to see more, make sure you click thumbs up or hit subscribe if you have not already. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any tips, tricks, pointers, or any series that you would like to see me talk about, also comment down below and we'll talk about that too. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.